The Mexican Council on Foreign Relations presents Coyuntura Comexi. In this episode, Leading the Way, Iranian Women and Their Long Road for Rights, a conversation with Dr. Janet Afary, Millichamp Chair in Global Religion and Modernity and Professor of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Who was Mahsa Amini, and what is the context in which her death sparked the massive ongoing protests in Iran?
Mahsa Amini was a 22-year-old girl. She came from the provinces, from Kurdistan. She was in the city of Tehran with her brother on vacation, and she was about to start college. There is something called a morality police in the streets, the big cities, where they check a woman's hijab. I remember being in Tehran and not quite wearing my hijab the proper way, and I was yelled at several times, if a strand of hair was showing or something. In recent years, they had become actually rather lax, but with the new president, Raisi, apparently he thought that the answer to poverty and unemployment and rampant corruption was to go back and enforce these rules again. So there was general anger in the country about the fact that the morality police had become more zealous again and once again. So she gets arrested for presumably showing some strands of hair. And then it's not quite clear what happens to her, but when she's in police custody, she gets probably beaten up or knocked out or something. And then eventually she collapses and she is taken to the hospital. She's found to have heavy brain injury and she dies. So the fact that this was a young woman, just coming for a visit from a very modest family, very modestly dressed from a province, and that this would happen to her in the streets of Tehran, it just really sparked a great unrest in the country. But it really is a continuation of what has been going on. For one thing, you need to know that Iran has had a long history of women's rights, going back probably 170 years. Middle of 19th century, a movement, a religious reform movement, the most important element of it was that the most important leader of it unveiled. Early 20th century, Iranian women become very active for women's rights to education, to come to public spaces, to write newspapers, articles, and so forth. In the 30s, and they become quite active, unveiling happens. So my grandmother's generation was the generation that unveiled. And then since then, the vast majority of people in the cities remain unveiled. And the ones in the provinces who did wear a hijab was a very modest hijab, which basically covered their hair. In the 40s, Iranian women were very active in the Communist Party movement of Iran. Iran and Iraq were the two countries with the largest communist movement. In the 50s, they were very active in all sectors of society, doctors and lawyers and judges, and large participation at the university. In the 70s, they were very active as part of the leftist student movement in the Iranian Revolution. So this has been going on. And also since the revolution, they were involved in the Iran-Iraq war. They were very active. They were elected to parliament despite all the limitations placed on women. In around 2000, early 2000, their numbers became so high at the university entrance exam that the government started to impose quotas on women, because Iranian women have ranked first in the world in several years in fields like engineering. Very savvy in terms of internet access and other kinds of access. And of course, in diaspora also, there's a very large community of Iranian women in all walks of life, okay? So the reality of the Iranian women's lives inside Iran is diametrically opposed to what the Islamic government wants to show it to be. These are women who now get married closer to 30. They've used birth control for decades, have had access to abortion. They date, they cohabit. There's something called white marriage, where young people will simply live together in a condominium building before they decide if they want to get married or not. I mean, in every sphere of life that you could possibly imagine, they are active and are out there. And yet the government imposes this sort of a strict hijab on them, maintains segregation, separation. So the reality of their lives is completely in opposite to what the government wants to present them, as docile women who are subservient and so forth. And I think the other thing is that in the last, particularly, I would say 13 years, women have been active not just on behalf of women's rights movements, but they've been leaders of a number of other social movements of Iran. So, for example, the campaign to free political prisoners, the campaign to end executions, a variety of these types of campaigns. When you look at the leadership, who is there? You see there being women in the leadership. Also, when there have been protests on the streets, unemployment, for example, water shortage, again, you see that women are at the leadership of these movements. So the men are used to having women in the leadership of a movement. This is not the first time. And they're used to having them in a movement that's not necessarily about women's rights issues. So what's new about this is that women had been protesting against the veil and the hijab, compulsory hijab, very bravely taking off their hijab and so forth. And they were involved in all these other movements. And so it's together, they've come together now. So they brought their movement for ending segregation. Just a couple of days ago, the movement spread into ending segregation at the university. So, for example, at the university, in the 1930s, when men went to university, women went too. But the Islamic Republic ended up separating, for example, cafeterias. We had to go to women's cafeteria, men's cafeteria. So just the last few days, for example, at Sharif and Tehran University, there have been really big battles with the security forces to end the segregation. So in that sense, to just put it in some context for an American viewer of these events, is that they're like the US civil rights movement in that sense. Remember the protest of African Americans and trying to end the segregation of, restaurants, for example, and places where whites could go and blacks could go. It's that type of a thing. Or maybe George Floyd, you could think of it even like that. In other words, in the same way that an African American woman is always terrified that, her son, mostly it's boys, but sometimes it's also women, when they go out, the police might stop them on some minor infringement and then arrest them, and then God knows what happens to them. We have a similar situation in Iran with women, young women, which is that they may get arrested on just the flimsiest pretext, taken into police custody, and then you don't hear from them, or you hear from them having been severely tormented. So that's the context for the present movement.
What is the meaning of the veil and at the heart of the fight against it?
The veil or the hijab means very different things in different contexts, right? So in parts of the Middle East, for example, in Egypt, it was voluntarily adopted by women at some point in the 1970s when they became attracted to the ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood, for example. Although that seems to be changing too, also in Egypt. In diaspora, the hijab is a marking. It's for a young girl and her family coming from a more modest background, more conservative probably background, and signaling that, although she wants to partake of aspects of society like education and employment, that she's not interested in some of the sexual openness of, in the case of United States, for example, I would say, of that type of culture. So it's like a signaling, that I want to be able to come and I want to be able to participate in all these things. But here's where I draw the line, and that ought to be respected too. In Iran, it's a very different situation. As I said, they were unveiled in the 1930s. When the revolution happened, women actually, initially in the late 1970s, leftist women decided to wear the veil as a symbol of solidarity with the poor and the more traditional sectors of society. So they said, let's wear the veil so that we could go out there and have the poor and have the more traditional sectors join us in this revolution. They didn't think it was going to be forced on them after the revolution. It was almost going to be like a uniform, a temporary uniform. And then when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, he was supposed to be some kind of a Gandhi figure, people thought. Maybe also they were a little bit influenced by, I would say, liberation theology of Latin America. The idea that there's a way to work with clerics, that Latin American liberation theology had a huge impact on the Iranian people, in the sense that, it is possible to work with the clergy and maybe bring about a better future. That it's not that the clergy are all reactionary, And so Khomeini presented himself as that type of a figure. He talked about imperialism and he talked about oppression of the West and so forth. And so it was the assumption, but that is not what happened. After the revolution, he decided to establish a theocracy. And very systematically, he went after women's rights, he went after leftists, he went after nationalists, and he and his supporters went after ethnic minorities and religious minorities of Iran. So this is the context in which the veil then became a symbol of the Islamist movement. And it was forced on women. And it took several years before they were finally, they arrested people, they tortured them. They used to put the hands of unveiled women in a bucket of roaches. They used to flog them, lash them. The standard lash, I believe, was 80 lashes if you didn't wear the veil. So it was draconian. And women agreed finally to wear it, basically because there was no other option left to them. But it's been a fight ever since the last 43 years, I would say. It has been a consistent fight by Iranian women, basically saying that it should be a choice, that if there are women in Iran who still want to wear the veil, that should be their choice to wear it, that they don't want to wear the veil. There's one other thing that I should make a distinction here, which is that the very upper echelon women now who are very affiliated with Islamic Republic, they wear the veil, and they wear a very strict kind of veil, which is black. So there you're seeing some protests against those women too. And it's not because they're veiled, it's because they symbolize the government, What they basically want is a freedom to dress as they wish. They want to end public segregation between men and women. And as they've been, become more a part of the world in which we live, the modern world in which we live. And I think right now they see an opportunity because with Russia's attack on Ukraine, we know that the West is really in dire circumstances and in need of oil. And they see that Iran, of course, can be in a situation where all the sanctions can be lifted, which would mean Iran's economy would dramatically improve. But the only people who don't want this are apparently the Islamic government. In other words, the Islamic government, Biden administration has actually bent over backward to try to lift the sanctions, to try to negotiate the nuclear deal. And, I wouldn't have said this before, but I'm seeing it, I'm watching it. I've been watching it for the last few years. But the government of the Islamic Republic has refused to accept that because they have this idea that there should be a sort of a Shiite theocracy that they're leaders of, all the way from Lebanon to Yemen. And so right now, I think I feel personally that the Ukraine thing has had a really big impact on the Iranian people. The fact that Ukrainian people are fighting against Russian occupation, that has been really quite motivating to people. And the idea that there's really nobody out there to help us. They're not asking the Americans or anyone else to come to their aid. They realize that they have to do it themselves, that they have to get rid of the Islamic Republic. And they're very nationalist. So this is not an idea of becoming subservient to any Western government, or for that matter, Israel, who would also like to see a change of regime, but it's simply to be able to have a democratic, secular Iranian society.
Does this not imply a major change in government, if not regime change?
This government is a theocratic regime. It has it drives its legitimacy by saying that laws should be based on the Sharia, which is a religious law. The veil is a symbol of that, of this segregation that's based on religious law, right? And hostility to the United States and Israel are the other two planks of it. So it doesn't want to compromise on these. The reason it doesn't want to compromise is that it is a revolutionary government itself. It remembers that when the Shah of Iran compromised, it very quickly lost power. So what they're terrified of is that if they compromise on veil or they compromise on issue of segregation, then everything will get out of hand. But of course, the fact that they don't compromise on anything makes people even madder at them. So it's like a catch-22 situation they're in. They don't know whether they should compromise because they think they should not compromise. For example, look, one of the things they do is when someone dies in these protests, they usually take away the body. And now, why would they do that? Because in the course of the Iranian Revolution, there would be a commemoration of the body, and there would be, 40 days after the death, there would be a coming together of people and remembering of the dead and remembering of the body, and the funeral would become actually a major issue. So they're trying to avoid that, for example. So they snatch the body away. A lot of these families have to go try to figure out where the bodies are. So their point of view is 1979. Don't compromise, they say, because the Shah's government compromised, and don't let them celebrate the martyrs, essentially, of this new social movement, because that would just give them more authority. And I'm not sure these things work anymore, because Iranian society is quite fundamentally transformed. Now, I'm not saying that this will be a revolution tomorrow, and this may be one of the chapters. I've been following this movement for, basically for 40 years, I've been following it. And particularly in the last 10 years, I would say it's accelerated. So every year, every 2 years, we've had a major, major social movement. And again, as I said, women have been in the leadership of it. So to me, whether they put this down or not, it will not end, because the issues are so fundamental and so basic. Theorists of revolution know that the cracks ultimately have to happen at the highest level of the state. So what we're seeing, for example, is we're seeing strikes going on, which is very important. So you have the students, you have ordinary people protesting, shopkeepers closed, which was also important. You've had provincial protests in Baluchistan as well as in Kurdistan, so that's also important. Parts of the oil workers, not all of them, have gone sporadically on strike in the last 4 or 5 weeks, for example. What you haven't had yet is breaks in the Pastaran, or at least it has been, we don't know yet, for example, if it has been. But what we also have is that people who are sort of known to be a little bit affiliated with the regime are taking open letters in the newspapers and telling the government to modify and to treat people better and to, so that is a signal. That's a signal that they're separating themselves a little bit from the regime, because they're afraid that if it changes, that they would then be considered the enemy of the new regime. So you see that kind of separation also going on, which is very important.
What can be said about the way Iranian women have led the struggle? Is something new or different about the episode currently unfolding?
I can tell you something, that this women's movement in Iran is closer to, when we talk about the role of, for example, Black women in the civil rights movement, because in the West, for example, in the United States or Europe, when you have, let's say, women struggling for suffrage, the right to vote already exists for men, right? You have a constitution. The constitution bars women And so you fight for the right to be able to. It's the same thing for gay movements. These kind of civil rights movement in America historically have been about trying to extend the rights that white privileged men have had to other sectors of society, whether the LGBT community or before that to women, for example. But in the context of Iran and most of the Middle East, you don't have a democratic system. So these women have to create a democratic structure in Iran before they can get their own rights as well. And they're very cognizant of that. So it's not a movement that you can just have a women's movement. It has to be a movement where you bring the men along, which is what they've been doing. That's why I was talking about how they've been at the forefront of movements and campaigns, which have not necessarily been about women's rights. So whether it's political prisoners, for example, I mean, vast majority of political prisoners, of course, are men. But they understand that the job essentially of creating a democratic order has been placed on women, right? But that in this process, they also have to bring the men along. So you see a kind of really collaboration. And what's new this time is that the men are willing to follow. That's really new. I mean, an Iranian filmmaker, actress, Golshifteh Farahani, said that what's so unusual about this women's movement is that men are willing to go and die for the cause of women's rights. And when have we ever seen anything like that, So in that sense, it's more like, as I was saying, like a civil rights kind of a thing where, whites would go and fight for the rights of blacks to be freed, and fight in that sense. In that sense, we have men now joining women, accepting women's leadership, who, by the way, are doing it not just intellectually, but also apparently they're very good in karate and judo, just judging by what they're doing on the street. So that's really quite interesting and very new, I would say, and suggests a very different level of collaboration and cooperation between men and women, which would be very helpful in future Iranian society.